Hi you guys. So I just played an interesting 10-minute blitz game against a player who was rated a bit higher than me. It was rated I think 1388 at the time. I just thought I wanted to do a blitz game because I wanted to try out a new opening, which I didn't get to do in the event. But the game was pretty good. I won the game, and I think there are some useful lessons in it. The main lesson being, I would say, to have an attacking idea and to commit to your attacking idea. So I'll take you through the play. So it starts with I'm playing white, and of course my rating's a bit lower at the time. So I think something that quite often I do, and you may do the same, is that when you're playing somebody with a higher rating than you, it's very tempting to feel a bit too much fear, and that can make me, anyway, play a little bit quiet, a little bit slow, a little bit timid, which I decided not to do in this game. My opponent replies French style with e6, so he's playing fairly quiet. I thought, well, grab the centre if it's offered. And then this is now the Pirc defence, so the small centre defence with d6. So I've brought out 2 pawns now. That's all you need to do to get all of your minor pieces out into the game. So once you've moved, each of your bishops needs 1 pawn to move in order for it to get out onto the board. So it's time to develop minor pieces. Knight comes out to c3, normal developing move. Black now plays c6, so playing quite close to his chest at the minute. I figure let's bring out the dark squared bishop onto the 4th rank, which is a good, sensible place for it to go. Black responds by moving his dark squared bishop, and looks like he's preparing to castle kingside. I bring out my light squared bishop to a square where it has the opportunity to attack on the kingside. There, I didn't really like the idea of bringing the light squared bishop to c4 because there's already 2 pawns in the way of that. So I thought this would be a more useful square for it. Out comes the knight, preparing to castle kingside. And now I move my queen with the idea of castling queenside. The bishops aren't in any kind of attacking position right now. So, and I do tend to, this is my style, I do tend to prefer opposite side castling because then you get the chance of a pawn storm, and who doesn't love a pawn storm attack? Black plays c5, attacking d4, and I don't really like the idea of taking there and then black taking back, and that would leave the queen with an open file on d. I mean, it's not the end of the world, because if I do get to castle queenside, then at least I'll have a rook on d1, which his queen will have to deal with. But instead, I think I prefer the idea of playing d5, because if black takes with the e-pawn, then I take back with my e-pawn, that will leave his bishop there on e7 pinned to the king. They'll probably go ahead and castle anyway. Black decides just push the pawn forward. So now what we're getting is we're getting a locked position in the middle of the board. And when you've got a locked position in the middle of the board, you need to think about attacking on one of the wings. Okay, so this is what I'm starting to think about. My bishop is under attack. I need to move it back, so back it comes to g3. Black then moves his knight out to a6. And what I think here is, okay, my first thought is I've got an opportunity to capture the knight with my bishop on d3. And then I look at my pawns, and I've got these, my light squared pawns are locked in the middle of the board on these light squares. So where is my bishop going to go from this point? So I figure that, he's obviously got ideas of bringing his knight up into the game, and I figure that his knight has more potential in this game than my bishop, so I decide to capture and exchange my relatively poor bishop for his knight. When you've got a locked up game in the middle, then I fancy knights might have a bit more play in the game than bishops might. Plus it gives him those double isolated pawns on the A file, and I'm quite happy with that. So then I bring my knight out, preparing to castle kingside if I need to. Black castles, I castle kingside. And there's potential opportunities to attack down either wing still at this point. Black brings out his rook, I push b3 to defend my b2 pawn, and black now pushes h6, obviously to defend or prevent my knight coming in there to g5. Every time you move a pawn, particularly when it's around your king, you are always creating another vulnerability, because there was something that was protected by the pawn, or partially protected by the pawn, that is no longer protected in the same way. So I move my queen up because I've got ideas of I want this knight to come somewhere. It can't go to b5, a4 is pretty useless, and with my queen there on e2, there's nowhere really for it to go. It'd have to come back d1, something like that, and move around. So I want to make room for my knight. My knight comes in. My king is now looking very snug in there, surrounded by pieces. And so what black has just done is he's manoeuvred his knight round so it's looking at f3 and h3. And I decide, let's consolidate the pawn structure there on the queen side. That is now pretty well locked down. Black's queen could get through, but the rook isn't going to get through. These pawns can't get through. The light square bishop certainly can't get through. So I'm feeling now like the queen side of the board is pretty much locked down, and I'm starting to think now about, okay, let's attack on the king side, particularly as we've seen this h6 pawn move, so things are starting to crack a little bit there. But black is attacking my knight here on f3. So obviously what I need to look at is the one option of capturing there. I don't want to do that, because then the dark squared bishop's going to come down from e7 to g5, protected by a pawn, protected by a queen, and is going to start kicking my queen around, and I don't want to be bossed around. I want to be in control of this attack. If possible, I want the upper hand. So then I have to think, okay, well, if we don't fancy that scenario very much, what does the alternative look like? So if you think about it again, if I take that knight, then I'm swapping a developed piece for a developed piece, but what happens then is that black's dark squared bishop comes up the board into an attacking position. Okay, so I haven't gained anything, but black has. Now what does the alternative look like? If I allow black's knight to capture my knight on f3, well, I could recapture with the queen, or I could recapture with the pawn on g2. So I figure that's probably not too bad. Now the light squared bishop comes in to join the attack, and now obviously if black takes and I recapture with the pawn, I'm leaving a gap in front of my king. Okay, that's not the end of the world, because his king is on the same file. So I've got ideas of maybe moving the king over to h1 and then moving a rook over to g1 where it's eyeing up that king. And if the second piece captures, then I just recapture with the queen. So that's not going to happen. So I decide to attack the bishop and put the question to it. This is actually a mistake, as you'll see in a minute, because the bishop captures. I can't capture with the queen, it has to be the pawn, and then the knight snatches the pawn that is now undefended. So I didn't notice that, missed that one. So my king is in check, I have to move, and I'm going to take the opportunity to move onto h2, where it's leaving room on the G file, so I can get a rook onto there, where it can possibly attack the king. Black moves the knight back because it was being attacked by my king, and now I move my rook. So now I'm thinking attack, attack, attack. Now I want the initiative. I want to put my opponent on the back foot, and in order to get a checkmate, in order to get a convincing win, you'll need like 3 pieces or so, unless you can dive in, snatch a pawn with your queen or something like that, and have a trapped king. You'll normally need at least 3 pieces in your attacking barrage to get the result. Black doesn't like the idea of that, moves his king to the H file. So now I decide, well, let's start breaking through. I've got double pawns on the F file, so shove my second F pawn forwards. If Black captures, I can capture back with 3 different pieces. Black does capture, and I decide to recapture with the bishop. So now I've got queen and bishop and rook looking at this knight, and potentially looking at G7 as well. Black is defending with a pawn and the bishop and the queen, so there's 3 attackers, 3 defenders. So if I initiate that attack, I will not win. Okay. Black decides that discretion is the better part of valor, and retreats the knight, which I think is fairly sensible. From there, the only other square it could have gone would be E6, and it would have been captured straight away. So the knight moves back into a defensive position. I am now thinking, okay, look, we are in attacking mode now. It's not the time to show weakness. It's not the time to be afraid. Keep the pressure on the opponent. So I move my queen over to G3 with the idea of queen G7 checkmate. Black is forced to do something about it. Now he can't play G6, because then that leaves this pawn on H6 undefended. My bishop will come in, attack his rook, and it's now removed another pawn from in front of his king. So the only real move here is, well, it could be either bishop to F6 defending the pawn, or this is a more aggressive version. So he's got still got the knight, the pawn and the queen defending G5. Now I figure I don't need to take that bishop again at this point. You don't always have to take a piece that's offered to you. Look at how will the board look if you do take, how will the board look if you don't take, and decide which look you prefer. Something that I've noticed as well is that at this point, because this bishop has just moved away, it's moved away from the defense of the pawn on D6. Okay, I could have gone in right now, grabbed the pawn on D6, it's defended by my queen, and I could have forked both of his rooks, but I missed that in the game, probably because I was thinking too much about my own attacking idea, and I missed another perfectly good one, or even better one, which would have been pretty much winning. So I'm thinking now I want to line up my rooks. I'm thinking about bringing my rook on A1, maybe over to H1, and then tuck my king in behind there. So I'm thinking queen side of the board is absolutely fine. Let's just bring all of our pieces to bear on this attack. Black moves his rook across, sensible enough. I carry on with my idea, rook to H1, and now Black pushes the pawn to F6. Okay, it seems like a further defender of the bishop. Then I notice that there is a pawn that's technically hanging because the queen isn't going to recapture. So I grab that, but the rook has now moved. Maybe Black saw that there was that potential fork and decided he didn't like it. I could even have grabbed C5 at this point in time. But instead of that, what I notice is Black's king, there on H8, cannot move anywhere, and there's a beautiful square on G6 right in front of it. If my knight can get into that square, that smothered mate means the king is in check and literally cannot even move. You don't get them very often, but I thought, why not go for it? You know, cause my opponent a problem, make my opponent respond. So black has to capture the knight. I recapture with the bishop. So I've now got the bishop there looking at h6. Black maybe is starting to feel a little bit of desperation at this point, because it's a bit of a rash move, I think, starting to push your pawns in front of your king. I simply move my bishop back. Again, I've got the opportunity of snatching c5. Black brings his rooks lined up, and I decide, okay, now it's time to slip my king away. So he's going to sneak off. This also reveals that h6 here is hanging. Knight moves back. I guess he didn't realise that h6 is hanging, because that's quite a scary situation. Maybe he could have just moved his rook forward to g6. My rook dives in, snatches the pawn. Rook moves in, I exchange rooks. I'm figuring now I am definitely in the stronger position. So king recaptures. I've now got an option of moving my rook to h2 with check, or my queen to h2 or h3 with check. And I decide that the queen is probably the most versatile option. King moves across, and then simple things, this pawn is technically pinned, so I decide now is the time to play f4. I'm attacking the pawn. The pawn cannot take. I'm threatening to capture, leaving black's pawns in tatters. I'm only one pawn up at this point in terms of material, but in terms of control of the game, it's all looking my way, and at this point my opponent resigns. So I think the interesting thing, the story of this game was, we locked up the queen side, and I was quite happy to do that. And then once that happened, I'm starting to move all of my pieces over to the king side, and to keep the pressure on, keep a sustained attack going. And black's queen, is not part of the defense at this point. Okay, so interesting one. I thought I'd share it with you. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time.